Yeah, hey now. Good morning, PSW staff, clients, friends joining us for Tuesday. Welcome. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed yesterday's film scoring assignment, the Coen Brothers Miller's Crossing. So get that into me by today. We'll see the results for Friday. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to stay in America today, and we're going to talk about somebody who I've been meaning to talk about, who I promised you that we would talk about. One of the most famous American composers who characterized Americana. We're going to figure out how and what that means. What do I mean by that? We know we live in America, right? When somebody says it has an American sound, an American feel, what does that mean? Well, they attribute it, a lot of times it goes back to this gentleman who wrote in kind of a modern, expressive theme, style, rather. Spike Lee said, when I listen to this guy's music, I hear America. And he uses his music and he got game. Also, his music was used to raise the morale of soldiers fighting in World War II. So that's how American it sounded. Let's just get right into it so you don't have to have a guessing game of who I'm talking about. Today we're going to be talking about the genius composer, Aaron Copland. Aaron Copland, a teacher, a composer, a conductor, best known for his stuff in the 1930s and 40s, but lived a long time. So let's get to, let's leave Miller's Crossing, those scary woods in New Orleans, and let's go over to Brooklyn. So this guy's born in Brooklyn, thick Brooklyn accent. 1900, another year that I love because it makes it easy for me to do the math. Lives 90 years, dies in 1990. So when you think of all the music that he's seen, I always think of you've seen, Gershwin, you've seen Big Band, you've seen the Beatles, you've seen Kiss, you've seen everything if you die, in 1990. He had Alzheimer's at the end of his life, so that's not good, but dies in Sleepy Hollow. Okay, timeline. Who's living? Who's writing during this time? We're going to be talking a little bit about Gershwin. So Gershwin's born just 2 years before Copland. Of course, Gershwin dies by 1937, so he doesn't get to see a lot of Copland's work. But the two were influenced. I don't know if they ever met. I'm sure they did. Bernstein's on there because Copland and Bernstein were very close friends, mentors. He was a mentor to Bernstein. Who else is on there? We have a lot of people that we've talked about. We also have Charles Ives on there, who was quite a few years earlier than Copland, if you look at it. Charles Ives, the American composer, who was one of the first to get Western European classical music education, and then saying, okay, but what about all these marching bands in America? What about folk music? What about jazz music? What is all this stuff? I'm just going to throw it into my symphonies and see if that's going to work. And that's what he did. And it created chaos and also genius, too, because nobody had ever done that. So Ives was really one of the first composers, because when you look at our country, it's only been a few hundred years old, as opposed to Europe, which is, hundreds and hundreds of years old. And then LA is like 100 years old, so, generally speaking. So, okay, what does he do? In conservative Jewish family, born in conservative, youngest of 5 kids. Mother knows a little bit about music, a singer, but mostly his sister, Laureen, was the strongest connection. She gave him his first piano lessons and said, you should get a musical education, and encouraged him. So by age 15, Copland goes to a concert and says, okay, I want to be a composer. This is what I want to do. So he starts taking lessons in harmony and theory and composition. And his teacher, Reuben Goldmark, also taught Gershwin 3 times or something. If you remember, Gershwin wanted to be more into the classical elite group, and not that they didn't let him, but if you remember Ravel said, what do you want to, why do you want to study with me? There's not much I can teach you. You already have your own voice, which was Tin Pan Alley jazz music. Although Gershwin was trained in classical music, he didn't have a European training like Copland and the other composers did, and I think he wanted that. But then if you think on the other side, I think some of the classical composers wanted what Gershwin had, not so much the money, because if you remember when he wanted to study with Stravinsky asked him how much he made, and he said, well, no, you should teach me. So it's kind of ridiculous that there were two separate worlds of serious music and non-serious music, which was jazz music, which we've looked at as highly serious, intelligent music, but back then was frowned upon. It was just kind of, anyone can do that. Okay, so, and we're going to see Copland taking some jazz, obviously jazz influences, incorporating it into his classical music, and perhaps that gets his American sound. But I don't know. I'm getting ahead of myself, but we don't know exactly how he's going to get that sound. So Copland goes to Paris and studies with a lady that we've talked about, Nadia Boulanger, who was only 34 at the time. And Copland was reluctant because no one, he said, no one had studied with a woman before. She was way ahead of her time. She's probably considered one of the best teachers in 20th century music, but probably just teachers in general. We looked at how important she was to so many famous composers. Philip Glass talks a lot about how important she was. Quincy Jones says, everything I learned about music, I learned from her. So he studies with Nadia Boulanger, and it's supposed to be a year, but he stays for 3 years. And he said she could always, and I've heard this from other composers that studied with her, when she would look at your music, she always knew what was a weak point and what was a strong point in your music. This was her genius in teaching. And she could tell you why it was weak. So he comes back to America around 1925 and becomes friends with Koussevitzky, who was the director of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. They had a long collaboration, long friendship. He was very interested in championing new music. Koussevitzky was super influential to Bernstein because he would program a lot of his music. So Bernstein, Koussevitzky, Copland, they were creating modern American music using jazz elements, but also staying somewhat faithful to the classical form, the symphonies, the ballets, stuff like that. But in the 20s, what's going on? You're getting classical music, but you're getting the Roaring 20s. You're getting this realm, whether you like it or not. Gershwin's there, Rhapsody in Blues, 1924. So Copland comes to 1925. He's probably, one of the greatest pieces was written just a year prior. Louis Armstrong's playing Dixieland music. Duke Ellington is playing. We're getting big band music coming in the 30s. So whether one likes it or not, American jazz music is dominating. So he really starts fitting in the 1940s. This is where he begins to, and somebody said that he started simplifying his musical language. He started paring it down. So if you have an orchestra, you could tend to overwrite and write many things, and sometimes that's your style. But he learned to pare down the orchestra. And if you have 60 to 80 players, paring down, exactly what does that mean? Maybe scoring, you're still going to be using all of those players, but simplifying it. Not in a way, and maybe this was his influence from popular folk music, where popular folk music is simple music. If you listen to a pop song, it's not going to be usually overcomplicated. And I mean a popular song in the 30s. It's a tune, it's a melody, it's 8, 12 bars, roughly speaking. He's not going to do that, but he's going to use that kind of simple form in his compositions. When he goes to Mexico in 1936, he really is inspired by a lot of the sounds. And one of the first pieces, El Salon Mexico, is what we're going to listen to. This was 1936, and this is a Mexican salon. This is he was witnessing dance halls there, and became aware of Mexico's nightlife, and you start hearing Mexican folk tunes and changing pitches and rhythms, something that Bernstein would use tremendously in West Side Story later. Copland said Stravinsky was probably the biggest living influence, and as we know from Stravinsky, he had violent rhythms. I mean, Rite of Spring has violent rhythms in it. When he comes back to America, CBS hires him to do a radio broadcast, and they hire him, and he writes something called Prairie Journal. It's a commission, and this is probably one of his first pieces to sort of show the landscape of the American West, okay? And this guy's from Brooklyn, so this is, Boston, New York, classical composers in the 20s, 30s, mostly East Coast. But what's the American West sound like? So this allows him to come, after this he writes Billy the Kid in 1938, and this is when he starts really getting his American sound. It was also good timing because these are ballets, and a lot of choreographers, including the great Martha Graham, they needed music. There was a vacuum there. They needed to fill this. Their new dance moves, for lack of a better word, they needed music to do this, and Copland was the perfect person to use this. And in 1939, he does his first 2 Hollywood film scores. Yes, he was a film composer of Mice and Men and Our Town. But like I said, when he gets to the 40s, so he's established his American sound, late 30s. 40s, becomes very productive and starts getting worldwide fame, mostly with Rodeo in 1942 and Appalachian Spring in 1944. 1942 is also the year that he writes a very famous fanfare for the common man. We listened to that in the John Williams Superman class because we talked about John Williams' use of the trumpets and the brass, and why does that sound American? Copland's using this piece that sounds so American-like, and I mean so much so that it was used for American presidential inaugurations. If you listen to Appalachian Spring, it's probably his most famous piece. It's very simplified. It's pared down for a smaller ensemble, and it's hard not to listen to this music without seeing the open prairie. This was, of course, influential too to Richard Rodgers, who would write Oklahoma 10, 12 years later. We did a whole class on Oklahoma, on Rodgers and Hammerstein, and that some of those even though that's a musical and those are musical songs, Rodgers really went back to Copland's Appalachian Spring and Copland's American music to find out what does sound prairie-like, what does sound like that, the openness. How did Copland? What was his style? He would write down fragments, he said, and he would just write down musical ideas as they came to him. And then when he would need to write a piece, he would go to the drawer and pick out some of these ideas. And he said, I don't compose, I assemble materials. So Copland's influenced by Chopin, who we did a class on, Debussy, who we did a class on. His music doesn't sound like Debussy, does it? I mean, I'm curious to see what you think, what his music sounds like. We know who he influenced, John Williams and John Adams, but who influenced him? I mean, this really sounds so fresh and new and American. It's also interesting because, Appalachian Spring is such an American sounding ballet, and I think he said that he was always amused when people said, how did you capture the beauty, of the Appalachian Mountains in your music? And he said, well, I don't know. I didn't know the title of it until after the music was written. If we look at Appalachian Spring, though, and Fan for the Common Man, are we hearing a lot of rhythms and music and pulsations? No. If you're saying yes, then no. We're not. We're hearing a lot of rests, he's getting mileage out of these songs. They're simple intervals. There's not really the tritone. There's some dissonance, but this is why it was probably so popular, because it was easy to listen to, and he got a lot of flack for that from serious composers, because audiences thought, well, this is classical music, but it's very easy to listen to, and it's very soothing and satisfying to listen to. So instead of all of these melody lines coming, it's a very simple melody, and he's using space and rests, which, as we've talked about, rests can be just as important as constant music going on, especially with films and ballets. Just because you have a film score doesn't mean it has to all be, when we look at a movie, not the whole movie has music in it. Many times there's no music on purpose in it. So he's getting mileage out of some of these songs, Appalachian Spring and Fanfare. Instead of overriding, he's simplifying it. He's still having melodies. It's not drone music. It's not ambient music like Brian Eno. Not really. But or he's using the orchestra in a way that's very pared down, and there's openness. There's room to breathe. Just like if you would look at a painting, and he was such an intellectual with the books he read and the painters that he adored. If you look at a painting, it looks on and on and on. Some of those Western paintings, that it's hard not to get sucked into how beautiful, the openness and the vastness of space can be. While he was getting flack from people that thought he was selling out in the 40s writing music like this, he said the composer who is frightened of losing his artistic integrity through contact with a mass audience is no longer aware of the meaning of the word art. Pretty bold thing to say. So if one thinks that art means no mass audience, then you're not understanding what art means. Art doesn't mean no money or no fame or no success. Art should bring people together, right? And if you get paid for it, then all the better. But who are you really writing for? Are you writing for yourself or the masses? He was writing for what he thought, what was in his heart. And if what's in your heart is popular and interesting and new, which it was with him, because he was being a first-rate Copland. And like Ravel said to Gershwin, well, why be, a second-rate Ravel when you can be a first-rate Gershwin. So think about that. I mean, we want to copy people and we're influenced by people, but only up until a point where we don't want to mimic them so much. We want to also have our own style and our own touch. So there's a fine line between pastiche, which is, you know, kind of a copy of somebody else's stuff, and true freedom, you know, in our art. So just some food for thought. Hope you enjoyed Aaron Copland. We could talk a long time about him, about his ideas. I don't think we would have James Horner, John Williams. I almost think he invented the American soundtrack that composers use today. That open expression, that vastness, that those simple intervals. Thomas Newman, all these composers do this. They use Copland's music that was written a long time ago, and they instead of, you know, a melodic song, he's going to take a melody, but he's going to spread it out. He's going to take his time with it. So something we should do in our lives. If we're driving force all the time, it's going to be exhausting, but if we just space it out a little bit, technically we should be happy, right? Okay, Aaron Copland, thanks for watching. Thanks for looking at this stuff. This is important. Tomorrow is just going to be amazing. I have no idea what we're going to be talking about, but it will be fun. Okay, love you, miss you. See you tomorrow.